Not long ago, I released a video on my spiciest takes on fantasy world building, and spicy it seemed they were. I got all sorts of interesting thoughts, both agreeing and disagreeing with my points, and I think it was overall a very positive experience and a pretty positive discussion. But there was one point in there that got me thinking about this particular topic again, and now we have this video that you're watching. This whole idea spawned out of me talking about a Shar-following halfling in Baldur's Gate, of all things. And in my attempt to articulate why it didn't really work for me, it sort of spawned this whole train of thought. And it really got me thinking about how we do and don't choose to portray well-established fantasy species in different pieces of media. I've talked about fantasy species before in a previous video, particularly on how they tend to be done sort of wrong, but this is both an extension to that video and something that's also, I suppose, attempting to answer the question, what is the difference and how important is the difference between non-humans and humans in fantasy stories? And once I thought of it that way, I realized it's probably one of the most important topics within all of speculative fiction's world building. Non-human cultures are a hallmark of the fantasy and even sci-fi genres, and while they aren't always present, when they are, there are just so many ways of them being done well, being done terribly, and in all cases, quite variably affecting the quality of whatever media they're put in. But to set the stage a little bit for this conversation, I'm going to introduce the scale of how fantasy species are made present. On one hand, you have Baldur's Gate, and on the other hand, you have Warhammer 40k. These settings have about a million things keeping them separate from one another, but for the purposes of our discussion today, we're focusing basically on the integration of humans and non-humans. In Baldur's Gate, you can more or less expect to run into any combination of non-human and human groups at any time for any reason. Interspecies relationships are a common staple to such a point that half-elf is a distinct, commonly used playable option. And no particular combination of species, class, and location is meant to be super unusual, even if you might expect some more than others. You know, elf rangers, dwarf fighters, half-orc barbarians, those might be things you expect, but seeing things that aren't them isn't unusual. Then on that other end of the scale, you have Warhammer 40k. If you see an elf and a dwarf together, or that world's equivalent to them, it's so they can beat the hell out of each other and exterminate their respective homelands. And the human faction is known for saying, "Suffer not the alien, the heretic, the mutant." Their most common first contact protocol involves warships, millions of soldiers, and a lot of artillery. It goes without saying that these are very different settings, and before we get started, I don't want to necessarily give the impression I think either side of the scale is bad. Interspecies relations look completely different because each of these settings is doing different things. Baldur's Gate is a not all that serious, kinda whimsical-ish journey that crams every fantasy trope D&D is known for into it and does its absolute best to restrict as few options from the player as possible. Warhammer 40k is inherently dystopic and meant to represent a violent, horrifying space fantasy world in which the worst people ever are somehow your only hope against something that, against all odds, manages to be ever so slightly worse. The idea of playing Baldur's Gate with 40k's interspecies relations is ridiculous. The setting wouldn't work at all, and half the main characters would slaughter each other. 40k with Baldur's Gate interspecies relations would do incredible damage to the feeling of the world, and giving the impression that everyone can get along would not only destroy the character of many of its main factions, but also make the constant warfare the setting is known for seem sort of arbitrary for the most part. Even Rogue Trader, a CRPG much like Baldur's Gate, has to pull several strings and make the character into an extremely unique type of person who is one of monumentally few able to bend that kind of rule to allow in just a few non-humans. And even then, it's primarily for an Eldar, the non-human type humanity hates the least, if not by much anyway. Then, of course, there are middle grounds, and I'd say Warhammer Fantasy manages to be that middle ground very well, and as experienced viewers of the channel know, I will use literally any opportunity to talk about that setting. But I digress. That is a world in which there is considerable species tension. The elves and dwarves don't like one another, but they aren't just antagonistic because they're different or something, or for just the vague elves and dwarves don't like each other kind of reason. They actually have lore. They have an ancient war that they fought over a dwarf's beard that scoured their relationships forevermore. True story. Despite that, for the most part, all factions, non-human and otherwise, who oppose the forces of chaos, demons and that sort of thing, work together, at least on the broad scale. Humans and dwarves are generally allies, and the High Elves usually work in the interest of humanity, so long as it also serves their own purposes. Friendships between members of different species aren't exactly common, but they aren't really all that strange either. These three settings make up three useful data points for what interspecies relations can look like, and there are a lot of other connections you can make about why they are where they are, particularly in terms of tone. 40k is grimdark and has a much less cooperative tone to it. Humanity fights itself more than it fights anything else. Baldur's Gate is all about cooperation, on the other hand, if you consider its connection to D&D, not to mention its generally lighter tone. In Warhammer Fantasy, though definitely a little more on the grim side tone-wise, is not nearly as far in that direction as 40k is. These are obviously not deterministic factors, though, and correlation does not have to spell causation if you're doing it yourself. But before I get too far ahead of myself and start talking about the way you might implement these species yourself or see it implemented in other stories, I'm going to introduce you to today's sponsor, World Anvil. Writing is complicated. World building is complicated, especially when you're working with sci-fi, fantasy, or other speculative fiction genres. Keeping track of all the relevant information from characters to countries to magic systems can be tricky, and it's very easy to get very disorganized. World Anvil might just be the solution to those problems. It's got a ready-made template and format for all your writing and world building needs, making it easy to get all your information down and keep it in proper order. Need templates to keep track of character information? World Anvil's got it. Need an interactive map so you can develop the unique personality of each country, town, and village? World Anvil covers that. Need templates for magic systems? Once again, World Anvil has come prepared. Even timelines feature is something World Anvil can help you organize, and let me tell you, the histories of fantasy worlds get very detailed, and having a visual indicator to keep it all straight can be invaluable. All put together, it can really get you that wiki vibe where all your world building is part of a solid ecosystem, where you can jump from one topic to the next with ease and add to any given subtopic as needed. So, if World Anvil sounds like the answer to your writing and world building needs, check them out at worldanvil.com and use the coupon code JBAT for a 51% off discount on any yearly membership. That's worldanvil.com, which will be linked in the description below. Once again, that's code JBAT for 51% off an annual plan, and thank you for not skipping the ad. So regarding our fantasy species discussion, the next thing to talk about is their relationship with traditional fantasy archetypes. To me, this is kind of the core of the discussion and potentially the most interesting part about it. Strictly defining fantasy archetypes isn't really a possible thing for anybody to do. Elves and dwarves and goblins and so on mean something slightly or even drastically different to different people. In the West, orcs are often relatively humanoid but appear in pretty non-human colorations and proportions, as we might see in Warcraft or Warhammer orcs. In Japan, orcs are more directly pig-like typically, and might have more pig-like complexions. And it seems that they're more interchangeable as a concept with a goblin, as we might see in the Bokoblins of The Legend of Zelda. They're definitely Japanese orc coded, but Bokoblin definitely is, as an etymological concept, closer to the word goblin. Needless to say, this isn't an exact science, but the core of it is about how closely non-human species stick to what defines them as non-human. That's fairly nebulous, but we'll try to nail it down. In essence, I think there are three ways of writing non-humans, which are sticking to, enhancing, or redefining their adherence to traditional archetypes. For our purposes, sticking to their traditional archetypes is what I would consider Lord of the Rings and maybe earlier editions of Dungeons & Dragons in particular, at least around the era of like 3.5 to be examples of. Elves are aloof and favor magic in the wilderness, dwarves love mining and gold and a good scrap up close. Humans are the jacks of all trades that rest in between everything else, etc. These are baselines, but given that one of fantasy's most defining features is variance between different pieces of fantasy media, these aren't hard limits. Halflings are typically expected to be good-natured, but can be otherwise, but typically still in a way that feels like what you'd expect of a halfling. We see this in Lord of the Rings once Sauron is destroyed and the Hobbit members of the Fellowship return to the Shire to find several hobbits have fallen in league with a group of bandits and looters who've taken over. While sticking to traditional archetypes might sound the most restricting, in effect, it isn't really always that way, because the ancient folk tales and stories that inspired most of the fantasy species we think about most of the time didn't exactly have universal concepts for even what exactly an elf or a dwarf was. We have them pretty nailed down now, but that was definitely not the case back then. All the same, sticking to these archetypes has its uses. Particularly in a practical sense, there's real value in establishing to an audience, here are the elves, here are the dwarves, you understand what they are, and not really elaborating beyond that, at least not any more than you need to. Expanding traditional archetypes can be a broad range of things, but it typically involves playing on an audience's expectations of what a fantasy species is known for, and either further emphasizing existing expectations or adding in new ones that feel thematically fitting. Dwarves from Warhammer Fantasy are a great example. They go from traditionally being materialistic and kind of greedy, as we expect from other dwarves, into having the possession of a culture that is fanatic about its craftsmanship and vengeful towards those who wrong them to such a degree that their High King carries around a great massive book detailing every single time the dwarves, as a whole collective group, have been wronged and who was responsible for it. Dwarven metalworking is emphasized further into making them significantly more technologically advanced than most other groups in the setting. They are the discoverers of black powder weapons and even have steampunk-type machines in their arsenal. These are all playing on things that already make sense for dwarves. They feel like dwarf things, but they don't really seem like a far stretch, even if they aren't things everyone would agree every dwarf knows how to do or that every dwarf in fantasy is like. But sometimes expansion can look a little different. You might take Warhammer's ogres, where rather than enhancing what was already there, new thematically appropriate factors were added in. Ogres have a much less specific vibe, at least in my opinion, in most people's mind, than something like a dwarf does, and so one could argue there's more room to throw in new ideas that still fit. And so Warhammer's ogres take the traditional traits of fantastical ogres of being ugly, strong, big, and bloodthirsty into making them worship something called the Great Maw, a literal pit of teeth in the mountains. Their society revolves around meat and gold, and many travel as mercenaries seeking work in exchange for both gold and the right to eat their slain enemies. And so, ogres, who typically aren't that interesting and are usually reserved for being one of hundreds of background fantasy monsters that you kind of fight but don't really think about, are now given a real culture and a real personality to them. And if you want to go even further than that, you have the ability to redefine fantasy archetypes. These typically take on two forms: adding in radically different factors to existing fantasy species, or removing ones that have come to be quite expected. Being the most extreme choice, it typically also has the most extreme outcome, either being very interesting departures that allow you to see these groups in entirely new lights or make them feel like entirely new things, or sometimes it can feel kind of pointless, could cause thematic clashes, or even make them boring, which is the worst thing that can happen. My favorite example of something I might call redefined are the Knack Mac Feegle, or Pixies, of Terry Pratchett's The We Free Men, and man, I was looking forward to saying that phrase out loud, and it didn't disappoint. Knack Mac Feegle. What a funny phrase. It's a children's novel, so the following example is pretty silly if you haven't heard about it before, but it takes your standard fantasy pixies or fae, these traditionally enigmatic, mysterious, sort of untrustworthy figures, and makes them into blue, angry, Scottish-themed thief warriors with names like Not As Big As Medium-Sized Jock, But Bigger Than Wee Jock Jock, or Daft Woolly, or Rob Anybody. Their existence makes no real sense. I have no idea why they're Scottish, but they fit Terry Pratchett's whimsy so well, and they're so fun to read about that I don't really care. Half the time you can barely understand what they're saying, even though you're reading it, which does provide a sort of mysterious quality to them. And while there is a basis in pixies or fey creatures being mischievous in the way that they are, the way it's played and the type of relationship they have with the protagonist are very different from what we'd usually see. They are a different type of whimsical than fairies even tend to be, for one thing. And so I see them as a legitimate transformation of the concept, as unserious as they are. Of course, and related to the reason this video exists, each of these approaches can have downsides, and quite a lot of them, if they aren't handled with as much care as everything else in the world is. I mean, ultimately implementing ideas without considering their ramifications is the cause for most problems in writing, but you know what I mean. And really, if I'm to tell you something as simple as, if you don't pay attention to an aspect of your writing, it may not be as good, then I should just hang up my hat and become a reviewer on Rotten Tomatoes or something. For stories that stick to traditional fantasy archetypes, the downfalls can be pretty obvious, but also kind of difficult to escape if sticking to those archetypes is what you want. The problem from a certain angle lies in the idea that if you're intending to write a story that's fundamentally new, but explicitly not create something new from the non-humans in it through evolving their archetypes or redefining them, then one must almost ask why they're being included or what their purpose is if you're trying to make a story that's actually original. Some stories I've read end up in this situation by taking for granted the existence and tropes associated with these sorts of fantasy species. Characters are introduced as the human fighter, the wood elf ranger, and the dwarf cleric. I've said before that describing characters in those terms is a really good way to signal you're basically straight translating a D&D campaign into prose, which isn't impossible but takes a lot of refinement. But the point in this specific context is almost that if you're writing your own universe, you really can't take those concepts all the way for granted. And as I've said, there is a legitimate and large benefit to working with classical archetypes directly. They do save you a lot of time explaining what they are if they are what the audience is expecting. But that only helps out of universe, for the reader. That doesn't solve their in-universe existence. If elves are written into your story because the audience will understand them, but no consideration is given to how your characters will understand them in the unique context of your story, then they aren't going to feel like a natural part of the world. And if you do spend that time elaborating on them in your world's context for it to eventually be only as deep as, the elves live in trees and hate dwarves, and the dwarves live in caves and hate elves, then it's most likely that not only will you still not really have explained why they should be there, but you'll also have wasted the audience's time by telling them something that they probably already expected to be the case. In essence, you still need something distinguishing your installment of these archetypes from other ones. Even if the broad fundamentals are the same, they need a reason to belong where you put them. And the other pitfall here is on a more individual kind of character writing level. Carrying on from our basis of Lord of the Rings as a good marker for these fantasy species archetypes, I've also seen a number of people kind of force their characters to cleave too far into the tropes of their species because they want the feeling of having Legolas and Gimli alongside their fellowship of characters. Obviously, this is in part just a symptom of unoriginality, but it's more of a problem in this case because pulling from common fantasy tropes for these kinds of characters tends to just reduce them to an archetype. This is all a little abstract, so let me put it this way. If you write Begalas Swiftleaf, and he's an archer who's aloof and perceptive, and his best friend is Dribbly Iron Knob, who wields an axe and heavy armor and tries to outdrink the elf all the time, there isn't a single educated reader who isn't going to know exactly what you're doing. I mean, if you use those names, they might find it funny, but you understand my point. And not that you can't do these things. In fact, you could try to play on those expectations, then hit the audience with something totally unexpected from them. But it's important, especially when your fantasy species is going to be almost entirely represented by one individual of their culture, that their character doesn't just boil down to being an amalgamation of that culture. It'd be like writing a Japanese character and all he talks about is honor and studying the blade and eating sushi and has literally no personality otherwise. In essence, the biggest, massive, really, pitfall is that sticking to the traditional archetypes needs to be done very carefully, or you're just going to rewrite everybody's first D&D campaign. Moving on, I'm biased and can say that the evolution of traditional archetypes is kind of my go-to solution, because I do like keeping their core essences, but you've also got to do new stuff with them, you know? But that obviously doesn't mean that one will do it right simply because that's what they're trying to do, and there are just as many bad ways to try and evolve an archetype as there are good ones. A poor evolution of a fantasy archetype would most likely spawn, I would think, from a poor understanding of the archetype and, frankly, lazy implementation. It's hard to get much more specific because what exactly that evolution could mean might vary in any number of ways, so it'll probably come down to the execution more than anything. But both of these issues, often coming together, might be created by the type of writer who is fundamentally writing traditional fantasy archetypes, but is either unwilling or even afraid to have their traditional fantasy creatures thought of as being relatively standard examples of their type. Said another way, the pitfalls of evolving a fantasy archetype is that when it's done badly, it's usually from someone who didn't actually distinguish their more traditional characters very well and doesn't find a solution that's effective. That's to say, someone might be writing some orc-type creatures, and they make them green, and they're typically quite violent, and their relationship with free will is a little bit tenuous, and then you decide, wait, these are literally just every fantasy world's orcs. And then you decide, you know what, they have guns, and their magic is based on the power of belief now. And then, depending almost entirely on execution, you either get something really stupid and tone-destroying, or you accidentally invent Warhammer 40k's orcs, which would be an amazing outcome if it hadn't already happened. But as you might expect, the type of archetype tomfoolery that can cause the most issues is when they are reinvented. And part of it can come from reinventing them in such a way that the old parts of them no longer resonate, and instead the original parts of the original creature they based things off of are what no longer work with it, because the writer didn't commit all the way to the idea that at this point, they're just making a new creature. Alternatively, if that reinvention doesn't actually replace what it removes, you end up with something boring. To keep with the 40k examples, Necrons are a great reinvention of the ancient Egyptian mummy trope, and more specifically of the Tomb Kings from Warhammer Fantasy. Necrons are one of the most interesting factions in the Warhammer universe, and despite their roots calling back to something we all understand, or at least aware of, in practical effect they feel entirely different, because GW went whole hog fitting them into a space fantasy setting like Warhammer 40k. The conception of ancient Egypt as a technologically advanced civilization for its time is expanded into making the Necrons one of, if not the technological powerhouse of all 40k, a superiority they maintain even millions of years after the peak of their civilization. But for all that they're great, there are a lot of ways they may have not worked. If they retained too much of that obviously directly Egyptian-inspired vibe to their designs, if they weren't skeleton-like but were literally just skeletons, if they weren't evoking Egypt but literally just were Egypt but maintained a lot of the rest, then that clash in tone would make them feel really stupid. And of course, on the other hand of reinventing tropes, there's the whole white toast with nothing approach, which seems like an easy one to avoid, but it happens a lot in a few contexts. There's a conversation that revolves around how much like the rest of their culture non-humans can or should be, and what it really means for them to act like non-humans while still being sentient creatures. Considering we, on the real world, don't really have any fellow humanoids to ask about what it's like being humanoid but not a human, we naturally have to make it up ourselves as we write these things. And so the result can vary. Lots of the time, a good balance is struck between these beings being obviously not humans, but still feeling like people. Of course, on one far end, it's easy to write every member of a non-human species as a monolith, as we discussed earlier, where they all just are the traits that their culture is associated with and nothing else, but doing the opposite can have a similarly negative effect. If the impact of a character's culture and background, from fear of making them too much like their culture, ends up making them share nothing with that culture or background, then all you've really made is a slender human with pointy ears, or a short one with hairy feet. Where the line is drawn for you in what most members of a non-human culture should do, would do, and can do is going to vary a lot, and there's certainly no one right answer. But if your non-humans are reduced to effectively just being palette swaps of humans, then you've taken one of the fundamentally most interesting parts of fantasy and thrown it away. It may be a fictional culture you're throwing away, but why throw away any for the sake of something you're making when keeping it or enhancing it would make it better? Anyway, this is all a very long-winded discussion, but I hope that all of that above stuff has summarized my thoughts and opinions about how non-humans are handled in fantasy and speculative fiction as a whole. And if this sounds like a place you want to be, we have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos early. As we close out, I'd like to thank our patrons Shadowrunner, Sani, Isaac Parrott, Raymond, Don, Sadako, Cavalier, and Sazabi of the Knights of the Inner Circle, Vion and Jody on Void, our Knights, and Greer, TOW, Craig, Victoria Lauren, and Noah, our loyal squires. And remember, we should have more Gorons in fantasy. They're unique and funny. I like Gorons.